There's something sacred about a Texas-style barbecue. The slow dance of hickory smoke curling into the sky, the hiss of meat meeting flame, and the quiet clink of tongs against the grill. All of it speaks to something primal, something peaceful. For years, our little cul-de-sac thrived on that ritual. Saturdays meant brisket and baked beans, kids running through sprinklers, and neighbors laughing over folding tables as the sun dipped behind the trees. We didn't have much in common, different jobs, different lives, but barbecue brought us together like communion. And then Karen happened. She wasn't new to the neighborhood, just newly empowered. After nudging her way into the HOA board with a promise of bringing structure, things began to change. First, she came for the flower beds, violations of aesthetic standards. Then it was wind chimes, auditory pollution. But the final straw wasn't what she banned. It was why. On a humid Friday morning, a letter arrived, official HOA stationery, Karen's signature in hard black ink. Effective immediately, all open-flame cooking devices are prohibited in front-facing yards and driveways. The reason? Air quality concerns. She cited the well-being of her asthmatic grandson, a child no one had ever actually seen. There were murmurs, objections, even a neighbor who tried to rally support for a vote. But Karen had already whipped up enough support from her clique, 3 retirees with nothing better to do, and the rule was passed. Just like that, she killed our weekends. I didn't yell, didn't storm the next HOA meeting or start a petition. I did what any good Texan does when faced with injustice. I went quiet. Not the passive kind of quiet, the focused kind. Because Karen didn't just ban barbecues. She declared war on flavor, on freedom, on everything that made this neighborhood feel like home. She thought she'd won, that we'd all roll over and nibble on kale chips in silence. But she forgot one thing. My brisket isn't just food, it's a message. So when she strutted past my mailbox that afternoon, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, and smirked at my now dormant smoker, I smiled right back. Not because I was defeated, because I had a plan, and it involved mesquite wood, a full rack of ribs, and the hottest driveway in the county, hers. It started small, as these things often do. A passive-aggressive email here, a strongly worded HOA note there. At first we laughed about it. Karen's concern over barbecue smoke wafting across her flower garden seemed harmless enough. She called it toxic air, even though the only thing toxic was her tone when she brought it up at meetings. She claimed the smoke clung to her curtains, that it aggravated her migraines, and, her favorite line, that it was triggering for her grandson's asthma. No one had the heart to ask why this supposed grandson never showed up at any events, or why she only mentioned him when she needed leverage. Still, the neighborhood tried to play nice. We moved our smokers a few feet back. We used smokeless charcoal. We even wrapped ribs in foil, sealing in the scent and the joy. But it didn't matter. Karen didn't want compromise. She wanted control. And when she managed to wrangle enough votes to push through her clean air initiative, the ban became official. No grilling in driveways, no cooking with open flame in public view, and definitely no smoke. The rule was buried in legalese and backed by a suspiciously fast-tracked HOA subcommittee. A few of us suspected she wrote it herself. The fallout was immediate. Weekend gatherings dissolved. The air, once filled with laughter and the sweet smell of pork shoulder, turned sterile. I watched my neighbor Kevin wheel his grill into his garage like he was hiding contraband. Families stopped hosting birthday parties outdoors. Even the ice cream truck driver seemed to pause a little longer before passing us by. It wasn't just the food that was gone, it was the heart of the block. And Karen, she flourished. Her yard blossomed with HOA-approved hedges. She held tightly curated tea afternoons on her back porch, inviting only the most loyal members of her clique. They sipped cucumber water and gossiped about paint shades and noise levels, all while basking in the silence she'd imposed. I once overheard her say, "It's finally peaceful now. No more smoke signals from that carnivore crowd." That carnivore crowd had names. We were teachers, firefighters, veterans, mums and dads who worked all week and lived for that one afternoon of grilling and good company. We weren't breaking laws. We were building memories, one brisket at a time. Karen didn't just snuff out cookouts. She extinguished a tradition. I watched it all unfold with a kind of quiet fury. She thought she'd won. She thought everyone would just roll over, scared of another violation letter or fine. But I wasn't angry in the way she expected. I didn't knock on her door or send rebuttals. I didn't call for a vote. Because this wasn't about paperwork anymore. This was personal. You can outlaw barbecue, but you can't outlaw backbone. And while Karen was busy counting violations, I was counting down. She had no idea that the smell of smoked meat she hated so much was about to become the centerpiece of her suburban nightmare. And it would all begin on a driveway she thought was untouchable. Planning a Texas cookout isn't something you do half-heartedly. It takes time, intention, and a touch of theatrical flair, especially when the guest of honor doesn't know they're on the invite list. I didn't just want to grill. I wanted to make a point so clear, so smoky, so mouth-wateringly unforgettable that Karen would have to scrub it out of her hedges for weeks. I began by rereading the HOA bylaws, not just the ones they handed out like candy during meetings, but the ones buried deep in the archives, written back when the neighborhood was more about potlucks than power trips. I found a beautiful little loophole. While grilling in driveways was banned, there was no mention of grilling on the public access strip, the 2-foot sliver between the sidewalk and the actual property line. Technically not hers, technically not mine, and most importantly, technically not under HOA jurisdiction. And wouldn't you know it? Karen's perfectly manicured driveway had the widest such strip in the whole cul-de-sac. Room enough for a folding table, a medium-sized smoker, and maybe even a few lawn chairs. But I wouldn't stop there. This wasn't just about meat. It was about memory, about making the kind of scene no HOA clause could erase. I texted Kevin, my neighbor and fellow barbecue enthusiast, and asked if his infamous jalapeno cornbread could make a cameo. He responded in all caps, "Tell me when." I knew I had allies, the ones who missed those Saturdays as much as I did, the ones who got the same letters and rolled their eyes every time Karen complained about the barbaric scent of smoked proteins. I circled the date. Saturday. Sunny forecast, no wind. Just warm enough to invite every scent particle to drift straight into Karen's open windows. The night before, I prepped everything like a general preparing for battle. Brisket marinated in my secret rub, ribs trimmed, seasoned, and wrapped. A batch of mesquite wood chips soaked and ready. I even polished the chrome on my portable smoker until it gleamed under the garage light. No detail was too small. If I was going to make a statement, it would be a delicious one. I set my alarm for dawn and slept like a man with nothing to lose. Saturday arrived like destiny, knocking at the door with tongs in hand. The sky was clear, the birds chirped like a choir, and Karen's house was suspiciously still. I loaded up the cart. Smoker, folding table, cooler, American flag tablecloth, a small Bluetooth speaker, and made my way down the sidewalk. Not into my driveway, not into hers. Right in the sweet spot of legal ambiguity where the HOA had no clause. I set up my rig precisely 3 feet from the edge of her concrete, wheels locked, table unfolded. I placed the smoker so the airflow pointed directly at her ornate bay window. A gentle breeze picked up, just enough to carry the scent. It was like poetry. I clicked the ignition, and with a whisper of flame, the rebellion began. Kevin arrived 20 minutes later with his cornbread in a cast-iron pan still warm from the oven. Behind him came Martha, from 2 houses down, carrying her famous peach cobbler in a dish covered with foil and a mischievous smile. Before I knew it, we had chairs lined up, drinks in hand, and Willie Nelson playing softly through the speaker. The first neighbour to walk by looked confused. The second gave a knowing nod. By the third, we had a small gathering. Someone pulled out a lawn game. Kids on scooters paused to inhale the scent of ribs and freedom. And then she appeared. Karen parted her blinds like a villain in a Hallmark movie. She squinted, tilted her head, and then vanished. 2 minutes later, her front door flung open. She stepped out in a sun hat and her HOA badge lanyard, flanked by a clipboard and an expression made of vinegar and fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to slice brisket. I looked up, smiled like I'd just discovered sunshine for the first time, and replied, "Enjoying the beautiful weather. Care for some cornbread?" She didn't answer. Her eyes darted to the smoker, then the food, then the growing number of neighbours laughing and passing around paper plates. I watched the moment it hit her, that none of this was on her turf, that no matter how tightly she clutched her rules, she couldn't stop this. Because this wasn't a barbecue, this was art, and she was standing in the gallery of her own undoing. By 8 in the morning, the neighbourhood was humming with anticipation, though most didn't yet know it. The smoker had been fired up, and already the scent of rubbed brisket was floating down the street like a warm invitation. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic. It was gentle, slow, deliberate. Exactly how you smoke a point cut for maximum tenderness, and exactly how you teach someone like Karen a lesson they won't forget. I brought out the chairs next. Foldable canvas, red and blue, with little cup holders on the arms. I arranged them with care, not quite facing the smoker, but angled so anyone sitting could enjoy the aroma and the view. I laid the American flag tablecloth over the folding table and began setting up the sides. Kevin's jalapeno cornbread, Martha's peach cobbler, a batch of deviled eggs from Lisa 2 doors down, and a few bottles of homemade barbecue sauce with handwritten labels like Sweet Heat and Bold and Smoky. I even had a small cooler full of sweet tea and lemonade, sweating gently in the sun, like it was part of a Norman Rockwell painting. The sound of Willie Nelson drifted from the Bluetooth speaker, just loud enough to be heard, not loud enough to be a violation. It was all within the boundaries. Every action was measured, every inch of placement considered. Karen might be armed with bylaws and citations, but I had something stronger, legality and mesquite smoke. By 9, I had a rhythm going. Turn the brisket, baste the ribs, check the thermometer, greet a neighbour with a paper plate and a smile. Some came cautiously, asking if this was allowed. I would simply gesture toward the sidewalk, that sacred strip of land not covered by Karen's rulebook, and say, "Technically, this is neutral ground." That was all they needed to hear. One by one, they joined the party. Then came the lawn chairs, folding picnic tables. Someone set up a small shade canopy. A little girl passed around hand-drawn paper menus titled Karen's Driveway BBQ, complete with crayon illustrations of ribs and potato salad. No one told her to stop. She was just expressing herself, like me, like all of us. I spotted Karen's blinds twitch around 9:30. They stayed shut for a while, as if she was still processing what was unfolding. Maybe she thought it would fizzle out, that we'd cook a burger or two and disperse. She didn't realize this wasn't just a cookout. It was an operation. A peaceful, smoke-filled protest built on brisket and neighborhood solidarity. By 10, the heat was rising, and so was the attendance. The smell had done its work. It curled into people's homes like an invitation they didn't know they needed. Even the HOA vice president wandered over in his gardening clothes, nodding politely, pretending not to be impressed as he helped himself to a rib and quietly asked if it was marinated overnight. I nodded. He nodded. Nothing more needed to be said. Across the street, Karen's front door opened with a dramatic swing. She stepped out as if summoned by the scent itself. Her outfit was calculated. Matching khakis and a pastel blouse, a wide-brimmed hat, and of course the lanyard with her laminated HOA badge, glinting in the sun like a sheriff's star from a B-movie western. She stood at the edge of her driveway, hands on hips, surveying the scene. The music, the smoke, the laughing children, the plates full of pulled pork. It was everything she hated rolled into one glorious tableau. She marched over, her flats clicking against the pavement. I could see her eyes scanning for violations, for some crack she could wedge her rules into. But there were none. I was in her line of sight, but not in her control. She stopped just short of the public strip, the invisible barrier that kept her power at bay, and said, "This is harassment." I replied without even looking up from my smoker, "This is lunch." "You're creating a public nuisance," she added, voice rising, hoping to draw attention, to gather backup from any lingering loyalists. But the crowd wasn't hers today. No one moved. Someone behind me chuckled. Another neighbor offered her a drink. "Lemonade, Karen." She refused, of course. She crossed her arms and hissed something about documenting this for the board. I nodded, pulled out my phone and said, "Good idea. I've been filming too." Her eyes narrowed. She turned, stormed back toward her house, and slammed the door. As I turned the brisket one more time, the bark forming perfectly along the edge, I knew the setup was complete. I hadn't broken a single rule. I hadn't trespassed or shouted or done anything that could be used against me. But I'd sent a message so clear even Karen couldn't ignore it. The flames had been lit. The smoke had risen. And now the front lines had shifted to her own front yard. It was just past noon when the air changed. Not the weather, the mood. You could feel it, like the pause in a movie right before the monster appears. The grill sizzled steadily, the ribs glistened with sauce, and the brisket, now resting in a foil wrap on the side table, had drawn a half circle of neighbors, all murmuring in admiration. There were kids lounging on picnic blankets, a couple of teenagers tossing a frisbee, and even Mrs. Donnelly, who rarely left her porch, had wandered over with a Tupperware container hoping for a sample. It wasn't a party, not officially, but it felt like one. The kind that grew out of warmth and hunger, not invitations and decor. And that's when the door flung open again. Karen stepped out as if the concrete beneath her were a courtroom floor, eyes sharp, expression locked somewhere between disbelief and righteous fury. But this time, she wasn't alone. She had backup. 2 HOA committee members, Mr. Feldman with his clipboard, and the always nervous Barbara from down the street, flanked her like poorly cast henchmen. They looked more embarrassed than resolute. But Karen, she had that look. The one where you just know she's about to unleash a monologue she's rehearsed in front of her mirror, complete with finger-pointing and a sudden burst of legalese. She didn't waste time. "This," she announced, gesturing to the smoker like it was a crime scene, "is in violation of community codes." I glanced up from slicing brisket. Actually, it's on public access land, and according to the city code— "Don't start with the city code," she interrupted, stepping closer. "You are deliberately provoking me, creating a hostile environment. I've received multiple complaints." "From who?" "Her plants." I could barely keep a straight face. The neighbors just watched, forks halfway to their mouths, waiting for the next act in the performance. Kevin leaned in and whispered, "Here it comes," like we were at a theater. Karen pressed on. "You are obstructing public space, creating unsafe conditions with open flame, and causing respiratory distress." She actually fanned her face with her HOA badge. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or offer her a napkin. "Karen," I said slowly, making sure every word landed. "This is a legal, safe, well-monitored barbecue on a non-HOA governed strip of land. If you've got a problem with that, you can take it up with the city." "I already did," she snapped, "and they're on their way." That made Kevin grin. "Hope they're hungry," he muttered, and a few people snickered. Karen's two companions shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Feldman looked at his clipboard like it might offer him a teleportation option. Barbara glanced back at her car with the desperate eyes of someone ready to bolt. But Karen wasn't finished. She pointed to the folding tables, the lawn chairs, the speaker still quietly playing classic country. "This is clearly a planned event. That violates the HOA's no unapproved gatherings clause. You need to pack this up. Now." "Nope," I said, cutting into the brisket with a smooth motion, revealing the pink smoke ring and tender center. "This isn't an event. It's lunch, and everyone here just happens to be hungry." A few guests clapped, quietly at first, then more boldly. One guy raised a plastic fork and toasted. Karen's face went crimson. And then came the breaking point. A little boy, maybe 5 or 6, walked up to the table with his paper plate and said, "Can I have more ribs, mister?" I smiled. "Of course, buddy. Take 2. Karen's jaw clenched. "You're feeding children now? Unattended minors? This is outrageous." The boy's mum, standing 3 feet away, raised an eyebrow. "Unattended? I'm right here. Maybe try breathing through your nose." That did it. Karen let out a strangled sound, a kind of guttural blend of a growl and a gasp, and stomped forward. She knocked over a cup of lemonade, tripped on the edge of the cooler, and stumbled straight into the folding table. Plates clattered. A bowl of coleslaw flew like a frisbee, landing squarely on her blouse. Everyone froze. She stood there, drenched in slaw, blinking like she'd just been hit by a tidal wave of barbecue sauce and humiliation. And then she exploded. Vocally, not literally, though the red in her face suggested otherwise. "You people are vile. You're undermining the structure of this community. You think this is funny? I'll have you all cited." She spun around and marched toward her driveway, slipped again, this time in a slick of peach cobbler someone had dropped, and landed on her side with a thud that sent her sun hat tumbling like a frisbee into the neighbor's yard. Silence, and then laughter. It wasn't mean-spirited, not at first. It was the kind of laugh that erupts when something absurd finally peaks. The kind of laughter that bubbles up from exhaustion, from frustration finally finding release. Even Feldman cracked a smile. Barbara? Gone. No trace. Karen sat up, covered in fruit and cream, and screamed, "This isn't over." I handed the little boy another rib. "She's right, you know," I said, grinning. "The brisket's not done yet." And as Karen dragged herself up, sticky, furious and powerless, the neighborhood found its rhythm again. One plate, one laugh, one bite at a time. Word spreads quickly in a neighborhood, not through formal meetings or newsletters, but through glances, phone calls, and group chats titled things like Cul-de-sac Watch or Karen Watchdog HQ. By early afternoon, the smell of brisket had done its part, but it was Karen's dramatic tumble into a bowl of peach cobbler that truly lit the match under the community spirit. Word got out, not just about the barbecue, but about her meltdown. People didn't just come for the food anymore. They came for the moment. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months started wandering toward the cookout like moths to flame, some cautiously, some with picnic baskets and folding chairs. I saw Mr. Lennox from the corner house, who once threatened to sue a kid over a football hitting his car, show up with a jug of iced tea and a container of homemade salsa. He didn't say much, just nodded, set his contribution down, and took a seat in one of the extra chairs. The unspoken message was clear. We're done being pushed around. It was beautiful in its simplicity. No grand speeches, no calls to action, just people showing up. Some offered to help tend the smoker, others refilled drinks, and someone set up a second speaker and synced it to the first. What had started as a one-man mission had turned into something communal. No one needed permission to gather. No one waited for approval to laugh. I watched as families began to mingle freely again. Kids chased each other down the sidewalk, dogs trotted between legs hoping for dropped food, and parents leaned against fences with plates piled high, letting the tension of the past few months melt under the Texas sun. It wasn't that Karen's rules had disappeared. It was that people had stopped being afraid of them. The shift wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was subtle and powerful, like roots growing deep beneath the surface. For too long, the neighborhood had let itself shrink under Karen's glare, adjusting their behavior to avoid complaints, lowering their music, cutting their grass twice a week, measuring how far they parked from the curb. But today, with brisket juice on their fingers and coleslaw in their laps, they remembered what it felt like to just be. Someone brought out a guitar, not to perform, not to show off, but to strum a few chords. A man with a grey beard and suspenders joined in with a harmonica. It wasn't a concert. It was background music to a neighborhood rediscovering itself. I watched the crowd swell from a dozen to more than 30. Some sat on coolers, others leaned against trees, all of them basking in the kind of freedom that smells like wood smoke and tastes like ribs. Karen's windows stayed closed now. The blinds remained drawn. She was in there, no doubt fuming, probably drafting up complaints and gathering stills from her Ring camera. But none of that mattered. Her power didn't come from any official title. It came from silence, from people not wanting to stir the pot. And today, the pot had boiled over and turned into a stew. At one point, Mrs. Hernandez, a woman who'd been fined for having unauthorized wind decor in her front yard, raised her red Solo cup and said, "To the cook," prompting a small round of cheers. I gave a nod, but the moment wasn't about me. It was about them. All of them. A few hours ago, they were a neighborhood of rule followers. Now they were something more. No one talked about revenge. No one chanted or mocked. That wasn't the point. This wasn't about Karen anymore. It was about reclaiming the space she'd tried to sterilize. About remembering that front yards are for gathering, driveways are for more than cars, and community is stronger than fear. Even the HOA vice president, after his third helping of brisket, loosened his collar and murmured, "You know, maybe it's time we reevaluate some of these restrictions." A few heads turned. A few people clapped. Nothing formal, nothing binding, just the slow turning of a tide. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the street, I realized that something had shifted forever. Not because of smoke or spice or spectacle, but because people had tasted freedom again. And once you get a bite of that, you don't go back. Not even for Karen. It didn't end with the barbecue. The smoke might have cleared, and the brisket might have been devoured, but the impact of that afternoon was only just beginning to settle across the neighborhood, like the final notes of a song that everyone knew would change them. There was something different in the way people waved at each other that evening, in the way they lingered outside just a bit longer than usual, letting the scent of wood smoke cling to their clothes like a badge of resistance. Karen, however, had retreated, not in defeat, at least not one she'd admit to, but in strategy. She wasn't the type to go down quietly. Her blinds remained drawn for the rest of the day. Her house, normally so active with porch decorations and perfectly positioned potted plants, looked like a bunker. No one went in. No one came out. And for the first time since her self-appointed reign began, the world outside her little fortress moved on without her. But Karen hadn't given up. That became clear the following morning when inboxes across the cul-de-sac were graced with a new HOA urgent update. It was an all-caps subject line, as always, followed by a PDF attachment that practically bled passive aggression. The message cited unsanctioned public gatherings, fire hazard conditions, and flagrant disregard for community safety. She even bolded the phrase, reckless culinary displays. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so painfully sincere. What she didn't expect was that this time, people pushed back. The reply-all responses began trickling in slowly, polite at first, cautious, but unmistakably firm. One neighbor mentioned the cookout was entirely legal, citing the city's easement codes. Another suggested perhaps the HOA should consider reviewing rules that had caused more division than unity. A third simply wrote, maybe worry less about ribs and more about kindness. Then came the video. Nobody knew exactly who uploaded it, but by midday, a clip had surfaced on the neighborhood Facebook group. It showed Karen's entrance into the cookout, the lemonade spill, the peach cobbler dive, all in glorious high definition. Someone had even added a dramatic slow-motion replay of her slipping and falling into the table, complete with a violin soundtrack. It had been titled, Karen versus Brisket, the final showdown. The comments exploded. Some were sympathetic, most weren't, but the tone had shifted. People were laughing, yes, but beneath the humor was something more potent. Solidarity. For years, Karen had ruled with intimidation disguised as order, politeness wrapped around control. Now the neighborhood had seen what that power looked like when stripped of fear. They had seen her fall, literally and figuratively, and realized the paper crown she wore had been made of nothing but hot air and entitlement. Even the HOA board couldn't ignore it. By the end of the week, an emergency meeting was scheduled, not to discuss new violations, but to reassess recent events and review procedural fairness. The wording was vague, but everyone knew what it meant. Karen was in trouble. I showed up to the meeting not to gloat, but to witness. The community center was packed. People who had never attended an HOA meeting before now stood shoulder to shoulder in folding chairs and along the walls. Some came with clipboards, others with cups of sweet tea. A few wore t-shirts featuring the words, "Free the Grill." It was almost festive. Karen arrived late, flustered, wearing a blazer 2 sizes too tight, and a face that had been practicing confidence in the mirror for hours. She took her usual seat at the front, but this time, she didn't get nods of support. She didn't get polite smiles. She got silence. The president of the HOA, a man named Stuart who usually looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat and began. He reviewed the emails, the footage, and the complaints, not just about the cookout, but about months of tension, of overreach, of fines and rules that never quite matched the community's spirit. He mentioned how neighbors were beginning to feel policed instead of supported. Karen interrupted him halfway through with a shaky voice. "I was only enforcing order. Without rules, we have chaos." Someone near the back spoke up. "Order's not the problem. Control is." That got a few murmurs of agreement. Karen tried to steer the conversation back to safety codes, but no one was listening anymore. The crowd wasn't interested in smoke regulations or grill sizes. They were tired of being afraid of a woman with a clipboard and a tendency to interpret bylaws like scripture. And then Martha stood up. Martha, whose peach cobbler had taken the brunt of Karen's fall. Martha, who'd once been cited for having a decorative flag 2 inches above regulation height. She looked Karen dead in the eye and said, "You ruined what made this place feel like home, and now you're mad because we brought it back without your permission." It was quiet after that. Uncomfortably quiet. Karen shifted in her seat. She looked to Stuart for support, but he was reading a new proposal someone had just handed him, one suggesting a re-vote on committee appointments, with an emphasis on community input and balanced leadership. She looked behind her at the audience. They looked away. The vote didn't happen that night, but the outcome was inevitable. By the end of the month, Karen was no longer head of events. A new committee was formed, one that believed in barbecues and birthdays and letting people decorate their lawns in peace. The bylaws were reviewed, and a revised version was distributed with clearer language, less wiggle room for self-appointed tyrants, and, most importantly, a reinstated clause allowing driveway grilling under safe, respectful conditions. Karen didn't disappear, but she faded. Her porch grew quiet. Her emails less frequent. Occasionally she would still peek out her window when I fired up the smoker. But she never said another word. Because that day, the one she tried to shut down, had taken something she valued even more than power. Her illusion of control. And all it took was fire, flavor, and a little mesquite smoke drifting across the lawn. The smoke had long since drifted away, but the scent lingered. Not just in the air, but in memory. For weeks after the cookout, people still talked about it, like it was some kind of folklore. "Remember when Karen slipped in the cobbler?" someone would say. And there'd be laughter, not cruel, but knowing, like survivors of a shared moment that rewrote something unspoken in the neighborhood's story. The driveway where it all happened became something of a landmark. People slowed as they walked past, even if only to glance at the spot where brisket became rebellion and a folding table became a line in the sand. But the true change wasn't in the sidewalk chatter. It was in the way people started to behave afterward. There was a shift, subtle, steady, and powerful. Neighbors who used to nod from afar now stopped to talk. Invitations to backyard dinners began circulating again, not formal affairs, just gatherings, spontaneous, sincere. Kids played longer in front yards. Lawn chairs stayed out later. The cul-de-sac felt looser, warmer, like it had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. I noticed it most on the following Saturday. I was out in my backyard, tending to the new smoker I'd finally splurged on. Sleek, shiny with a temperature gauge I didn't really need but liked having anyway. I wasn't cooking for anyone in particular, just enjoying the rhythm of it, the hiss of the fire, the rich aroma of hickory wood, the way the early afternoon sunlight danced across the patio. And then I heard it. Not a complaint, not a demand, just footsteps and a voice. "Smells amazing," someone said from over the fence. It was Mr. Jenkins, a man who once filed 3 separate noise complaints about a 4th of July party back in 2020. He held a can of soda and a cautious smile. "Mind if I just stand here a minute?" he asked. "Reminds me of when my dad used to cook." I told him to stay as long as he wanted. He did. We talked for nearly an hour, about meat, about memories, about nothing. And that, I realized, was the victory. Not Karen's removal or the rule changes, though those certainly mattered. The real triumph was in the return of small things, the conversations, the shared smells, the collective comfort of being part of something that didn't require permission. Karen, for her part, stayed quiet. Her porch remained empty, her garden well kept, but suddenly sterile. She had become a spectator in the community she once tried to control. Occasionally, she passed by during walks, head held high but eyes darting away at the first sign of engagement. No one shunned her. No one mocked her. But no one followed her anymore either. That, in the end, was worse for her than any official demotion. She had gone from self-proclaimed leader to background character, and the script no longer had her name on it. The HOA changed too. Slowly. The board meetings opened up, new voices were heard, rules were clarified and, where necessary, softened. A new tone emerged. Less about enforcement, more about encouragement. The community barbecue Karen had once weaponized as a symbol of chaos was now rebranded as a quarterly event. I was asked to help organize the next one. I said yes, on one condition. Everyone gets a turn at the grill. As for me, I didn't become some neighborhood hero. That wasn't the point. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because there comes a time when you have to decide if silence is worth your peace. For me, it wasn't. And now, as I walked down the street on a quiet Sunday evening, the breeze carrying the faint smell of someone else's chicken wings in the making, I smiled. Not because things were perfect, but because they were real again. And all it took was a little smoke. The invitation came tucked beneath my doormat. Not an email, not an official HOA notice. Just a folded piece of thick paper sealed with a sticker that read, "Let's try again." It was from the new events committee, formed after Karen's resignation had been quietly accepted and even more quietly celebrated. Inside, it simply read, "Community barbecue, Saturday. Open lot near the park. We'd love it if you'd handle the grill." No signatures, just the invitation and the trust that came with it. I read it twice, smiled, and slid it into my back pocket. Saturday arrived with the kind of weather that almost felt staged. Clear blue skies, a light breeze, and the sun shining with just enough strength to make shade valuable, but not necessary. The park's open lot had never hosted much beyond the occasional toddler soccer game or overflow parking during holidays. But today, it looked like something out of a welcome brochure. Tables lined with checkered cloths, coolers filled with soda and lemonade, and a hand-painted sign fluttering in the breeze. "Welcome back, neighbors." I arrived early, as any decent grillmaster should. My new smoker came with me, gleaming like a trophy on wheels. I rolled it to the center of the lot, planted it like a flag, and fired it up. Within minutes, the scent of mesquite began to drift through the air, that familiar perfume of smoke and spice working its way into the atmosphere. People followed. They came in slow waves. Families, couples, solo wanderers. Some brought side dishes, others brought stories. I saw Kevin juggling 2 trays of chicken legs and a nervous smile. I saw Martha cradling another legendary peach cobbler like it was a newborn child. Even Mr. Lennox appeared, this time without complaints, only a cooler and a quiet nod. No speeches were made. No official program was followed. Just people, food, and music from a speaker someone had placed on a picnic bench, playing old soul tracks and twangy country ballads. Kids kicked soccer balls. Parents stood in loose circles with paper plates balanced on palms. There was no tension, no hierarchy, no HOA hovering over shoulders with clipboards and measuring tape. Just neighbors. Then, around midday, I saw her. Karen stood near the edge of the lot, sunglasses on, arms crossed. She wasn't wearing a name badge or a clipboard, no lanyard, just a neutral expression that betrayed a storm of emotion behind her perfectly powdered face. She didn't approach, didn't speak. She just stood there, taking it in. For a moment, I considered walking over, maybe offering her a plate, even if just for the gesture. But before I could move, she turned and walked away. Not in anger, not in embarrassment, just gone. And somehow, that felt right. Some doors don't need to be reopened. Some lessons don't need words to be remembered. I returned to the grill, flipped the ribs, and added a fresh coat of sauce. A boy nearby whispered to his sister, "That's him." The guy from the brisket day. She giggled and they both waved. I tipped my tongs in their direction like a scepter. We all played our roles. As the sun dipped lower and golden light stretched across the park, I watched as people lingered again, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. Stories were shared over sticky fingers. Laughter replaced the sound of ticking clocks. And when it was finally time to pack up, no one rushed to leave. They folded chairs slowly, rinsed trays in the public fountain, and promised to do it again soon. Not with forms, not with regulations, but with food, laughter, and maybe a little more fire. The grill was the last to go cold. I closed the lid, locked the wheels, and looked out over the field, now empty of tables, but full of something better: memory. And as I headed home, the stars blinking awake above, I realized something profound in its simplicity. You don't need a title to lead. You don't need permission to create peace. You just need to show up, bring the heat, and cook like you mean it. The throne Karen once guarded with rules had burned out, but something better took its place: respect, earned with fire and sealed in smoke.